It's Nature Wins podcast, a climate adaptation journey. I'm your host, Maureen and Eric. This is Cape Ann's climate story, a storied place. Gloucester, Rockport, Essex, and Manchester by the Sea. Coastal communities of people who know their way around a storm, but were vulnerable to climate threats and working on coastal resilience. It's Nature Wins, and I'm your host, Maureen and Eric. We're here in the Streamography Studios in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and I'm here with NOAA biologist Eric Hutchins. He's also a Rockport resident. Before we get started, Eric, I just wanted to say thank you so much to our sponsor, Common Crow Natural Market in Gloucester. Welcome to the podcast.
I'll be going to Common Crow as soon as I leave here.
Oh, really? Oh, that's great. They love to hear that.
I am. It's on my list.
Wonderful. So Eric, on our podcast today, we're talking about the $5.38 million settlement from the DOJ with National Grid. We're going to talk about how that plays into ecological restoration, habitat restoration in Gloucester, in the harbor. We're going to get into the details about that. But before we do so, could you tell me a little bit about your role at NOAA and what you do there?
Okay. Yeah. I'm a fisheries biologist, and I've worked with NOAA since 1993. I started out doing permit reviewing dredging projects, docks and piers in order to protect shellfish beds and commercial and recreational fisheries and coastal habitats. So I did that for a number of years. And maybe around 1996 and 1997, somewhere in that range, someone came up with this idea in headquarters, and they took a little bit of slush money, about $40,000, and said, hey, let's start a program called community-based habitat restoration. So utilizing NOAA biologists to work with local groups, citizens, or organizations to implement not just protecting, but restoring coastal habitats. And I jumped on the opportunity and got one of the first projects done in the country, which was actually, probably most of the viewers of this know, Cranes Beach. Next time you drive to Cranes Beach, just before you get to the gatehouse where you pay your money, just before that was a major 12-acre habitat restoration project, one of the first done in the country of its type. And that program grew from $40,000 to $200,000, and this year it's $750 million, $750 million is going out the door through our program, and a variety of funding mechanisms to do the same kind of work at a much larger scale. Dam removals, shellfish bed restoration, coral restoration, trying to fit the pieces back together of a lot of the things that we've destroyed over 400 years, recognizing it's where we need to be.
So most of the work that you do is in New England?
My work initially was the Gulf of Maine. So I actually even did a little work in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, all of Maine, all of Cape Cod, and I did a little bit out sprinkled in Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. That was Eric's zone. These days, I'm limited because we've hired a lot more staff. I'm the Piscataqua River in Maine to the Cape Cod Canal. That's my focus area that I've worked in the past 7 or 8 years, and we have new staff that are covering those outlying areas.
It's really fascinating. I have a question about the work that you're doing on dam removal. And just as an example of what you're doing there, could you tell us a little bit more about why you're doing the dam removal and kind of where you're doing it and just how that's beneficial?
Yeah, dam removal has grown significantly. I actually worked on the very first dam removal in Massachusetts for fish passage. So it was down in Plymouth. We removed a dam that actually went back to the 1700s, all junk, with a river herring run, similar to what we have here in Gloucester, the Little River. But this run actually had a lot more fish in it, but they couldn't make it upstream anymore. Most of the focus of the National Marine Fisheries Service with dam removal in New England is to get diadromous fish back upstream so that they can forage or lay their eggs. Up to 95% of all the stream systems in New England are blocked to fish migration. 95%.
It's extraordinary.
It's huge.
Yeah.
These runs of fish were decimated so long ago that we don't even know what their stock sizes were in colonial times. We don't know. where we actually have estimates of what stocks are recently. We don't know what the historical ones. We believe we're running at about 1 to 2% of the stock size of what they naturally would have been. The reason we do a lot of these, obviously it's for species like Atlantic salmon, but river herring in particular, you can have runs of river herring of 8 to 10 million fish in a river, a big river.
That's amazing.
8 to 10 million fish. That's, let's call it 5 million females putting out 40,000 babies each. Billions and billions of potential baby fish making out to the ocean, feeding tuna, codfish, striped bass, bluefish, the basis of the food chain for ospreys, marine mammals, and seabirds. That food source was cut off for up to 300 years plus. So that is the primary driver between our dam removal programs. There's a lot of secondary benefits, resiliency, flood control, sediment movement, but the primary one, at least from our agency's perspective, is restoring the migratory fish and restoring those stocks.
Wow, that's quite a lot of really important work that you're doing. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks.
All right, so it was reported in the Gloucester Daily Times, and there was a press release from the Department of Justice that came out in July of this year, 2023, that outlined a settlement with National Grid for pollution from the old Gloucester Gas Light Company that operated in like the late 1800s to 1950.
Yep.
And all of that coal tar was just dumped in the harbor.
Yeah. Well,
So,
kind of, but
kind
yeah,
of.
that's where it showed up.
Oh, that's where it showed up.
Right.
You got to take us down that line.
Yeah.
But it's for restoration of natural habitats.
Yes.
And I'd like for you to explain to our listeners and our viewers more about how that actually came to be, because I know that there was a lot of work behind the scenes, and then the settlement came out, and we're waiting for the money to come in. How is it gonna be used? So,
Yep.
take us back to the beginning. Give us sort of a behind the scenes look at what was going on.
Okay. Yeah. So, what was the actual year? It was about 10 years ago. Actually, I think it might have been more than 10 years ago. The exact date doesn't matter, but over 10 years ago, the U.S. Coast Guard was doing some dock work at Harbor Loop. So for everyone knows where the Coast Guard station is at Harbor Loop in Gloucester, they were installing new pilings for their docks, and they hit oil, for lack of a better word. Bubbling sheen came up on the property of the very people who are responsible for preventing and dealing with oil spills, which is our U.S. Coast Guard. They're one of the first responders. So, of course, they reported. So it was a reportable incident. There was a fair-sized plume coming up, and no one truly knew what it was or what it was from. So it turns into an investigation, and didn't take long for them to find out that there was certainly a lot more coal tar. There was coal tar in the harbor, and the property was previously owned by a coal tar gasification plant. So what they used to do here all throughout the country, and actually this situation exists all around the country, is when we were shifting from whale oil, believe it or not, shifting from whale oil, we didn't jump always immediately necessarily to oil. We went to coal, and they had a process where you could basically grind up coal and heat it and make gas. And we actually pumped gas into the streets for streetlights from the coal gasification process. And a byproduct of the coal gasification process is coal tar. And the tar had some uses. They put it on pilings, like creosote, but otherwise it was a waste product. And at the time, it wasn't against the law to get rid of it however you want, because those laws weren't written yet. Later on, those laws were written, and even though National Grid, through large-scale purchases, the way corporations buy one to another, you end up taking their assets and their liabilities. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those liabilities might even be in a site you don't do anything anymore. They don't even own the property anymore. It's owned by other people, but they still owned the liability, unfortunately for them. So, surprise to them, So then they had to go through a full-blown process of determining what chemicals were there and how far ranging, like where were they? So they hired consultants and, so to speak, carpet bombed the upland and the harbor and found that there was coal tar residuals in the upland side, so underneath the parking lots and near that little park near the Coast Guard, and multiple acres of the harbor bottom just off the Coast Guard station had residuals that had their signature on it. When I say signature, you can actually get a chemical signature that aligns with, it's the same stuff that was in the upland. So they were doing everything as needed and as expected. No qualms there at all. They worked with the city's Conservation Commission. They came up with a plan to dredge the harbor, to build barriers, to dig stuff up. I mean, they had a full-blown plan. And at the, so to speak, at the tail end of when their plan was getting implemented, somehow or another this one slipped through the cracks a little bit. The NRD, Natural Resource Damages side of the state and federal agencies, which is NOAA and Fish and Wildlife Service, we found out about this. Even though we all saw it, we didn't catch that. Wait a second. I raised the flag one day and said, is there an NRD case underway for this? And what NRD is the laws that say you owe for past damages, not just you need to do your cleanup. The state was implementing, you need to do your cleanup, and they were doing it. And then before statute of limitations kicked in, so to speak, we came in and said, but there's another law that applies to this, which is dealing with natural resource damages, similar to like the Exxon Valdez and others.
So is this the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act?
That's it.
Yay.
Yes, and a lot of that comes from Exxon Valdez. That was kind of the origination of these,
Yeah.
Oil Spill Act. And they were a little caught off guard at first, but they said, okay, we get it. So then we emerged, even after the cleanup was all done. So we looked at all of their data, our scientists and from the state.
You mean National Grid's data?
Their data, and they actually had very good data. So we didn't even have to push them to collect new data. They had already collected all the data, and it was a pretty clear case that what was in the harbor, they already agreed was their responsibility. So what we do is do a calculation in a nutshell, how many years since the act was passed, how many acres, and we quantify the acre years of damages. I won't get into the real nitty-gritty of the modeling, but that's it.
But I bet you could.
Yeah, but in a nutshell, that's what we do.
Yeah.
How much acres did they disturb for how many years?
So what was that?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head
Okay.
exactly, but we negotiate. And this is what was going on over the past number of years. So we've been negotiating for 9-ish years. We believe it's 126 acres you owe, and they'll counter and say, we think it's this. And then there's a settlement. And that's where the 5.38 million came from. So part of the ways we calculated it, we came up with acre years. And then what I and other of our staff did is we found potential projects in Gloucester and quantified them. So, okay, we have a project. What does it cost to restore 10 acres of a salt marsh? We would look at all the data that's available, and there's a lot of data available throughout Massachusetts, what it costs to restore an acre of salt marsh. And it's upwards of $600,000 per acre. It's not cheap. So this was all the negotiation processes. And then at the tail end, through any negotiation, we're not going to court. This is the ability to not go to court. It's a settlement. And all parties are comfortable. And that's Department of Justice put that package together. That's why it comes from Department of Justice. And that was the settlement number, $5.38 million. And they paid past expenses for our staff time. And that money now is sitting in I think it's with might still be with Interior. It might be with Department of Justice right now. It doesn't really matter. It's in the government's bank account now. We have it.
Great.
And that's a big milestone. The next step for us to do is to do what's called a restoration planning process. And that's what's going to be engaged. We've just started it. we've met with the mayor of Gloucester. We've done a little bit of outreach. We did a press release letting everybody know what's going on, made the front page of the paper. We've come up with a couple of slideshows. We've just started the tip of the iceberg. And then our plan would be sometime this winter, we will be working collaboratively with the state of Massachusetts. It'd be NOAA and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Those are the three trustees. It's not local. It's the two federal agencies and the state agency. And that's called the trustee council. I'm the trustee council representative for NOAA in this case right now. And then we will work with a consulting firm this winter, hire one who will work with us to draft a restoration plan. With our input. We will give them lots of input. And as part of that process, we will be doing public outreach, asking the public what their ideas are. What do they want? What are their interests? We will probably make some suggestions of projects that we know about. In my case, since I've been working in the Cape Ann area for so long, I know a lot of potential projects. So
why don't we get into that? Because that's really fascinating. Well, but before we go there, I was really struck in the press release from DOJ and also in the paper that this is for the public's good. This is payment to the public to restore these natural resources, and that's just an important piece of this. It's for all of us.
Yes, and the environment is for us. So, but it's about the environment for us. It's for the environment, but in the end, who functions and values. It's human values.
Yes. Yeah, but it's also for the fisheries and for the wildlife. So let's talk about projects, because this is not, as you just mentioned, really a local project. So it's not the city of Gloucester or other municipalities on Cape Ann that are making the decisions. It'll be the trustees that you just outlined, and there's going to be this public outreach. So what kind of projects are you thinking about?
So we've had a couple of NRD cases over the past 20 years in this area. One in Chelsea, big one down in New Bedford. So we've had a few. These aren't common. And in some ways, Gloucester is lucky to have found the contamination and got it cleaned up. And we have a sizable chunk of money to work in this area. And when I say this area, it's not 100% defined as just the city of Gloucester, but the functions and values that we'll be restoring have got to be related at the very least. Certainly, Gloucester's primary, hands down. That's the focus. But it's not to say if there wasn't a super duper project right over the border that provided fish that benefited Gloucester Harbor, that would be a viable option. In the end, we want fish, we want wildlife that benefits Gloucester Harbor, one way or the other.
Right.
The type of projects, which a lot of people have probably heard about for the years, one is salt marsh restoration. We've got a lot of salt marsh habitat in Gloucester. We have a lot of degraded salt marsh habitat. There would be options for, and I don't hesitate to use this as an example. One is some people, younger and older, will remember there used to be an old swimming pool right next to the Gloucester High School, a concrete swimming pool. We spent some money a number of years ago working with the city of Gloucester to actually remove all that concrete from the abandoned swimming pool, which I grew up in Gloucester. My dad did. He swam in that as a kid back in the 30s and 40s. Many people did, but it was never taken care of, and there was super sharp rebar sticking out of it. So it was an opportunity to take a dangerous situation and create intertidal mudflats and salt marsh habitat. There's a real small scale example. For those that go out to Eastern Point, a number of years ago, I worked with the city of Gloucester and Mass Audubon, and the culvert that supplied the water to the marsh at the lighthouse completely filled in. Worked with the city and Mass Audubon, installed a new culvert, and we now have flow going back and forth. Efforts to do eelgrass restoration in Gloucester Harbor. Gloucester Harbor is extremely productive for winter flounder in particular. Winter flounder love eelgrass habitat. So all of the people that like to go recreational fishing should, if they don't know, love eelgrass because it's really good winter flounder habitat so that we can go fishing, recreational fishing.
Well, I know that you're a fisher, so.
Yeah, so there's a lot of these habitats that directly benefit us that we would be looking at. So eelgrass habitat or potentially some shellfish habitat, working with the harbor masters in Gloucester. Salt marsh. We work on a lot of projects that restore fish runs. There's a fishery in Gloucester, usually in the months of November's peak, for rainbow smelt. There may be some opportunities to enhance their spawning habitat. So we'll be looking at the whole variety.
So, so when selecting some of these amazing projects, like how do you choose? Do you get to do all of them, or will $5.3 million can go real fast when you're looking at a restoration project,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
there's so much to do. How do you get started? Like,
So what will be done as far as the restoration planning process is no projects will happen in the short term. We have to do the planning process first.
how long does that take?
It's usually a year.
Okay,
So
that's not too long.
if we get the ball rolling this winter, it'll actually result in a restoration plan. It'll be a document a couple inches thick. It'll be a restoration plan and a National Environmental Policy Act EA, which is an environmental assessment. They'll be kind of combined. So it'll be what's called a NEPA document with the restoration plan, and they get combined. And there will be a solicitation. We will do outreach to describe kind of what I'm doing tonight. This is kind of a precursor.
Yeah.
Much of what I'm doing tonight, I or somebody else will be repeating at a public meeting, maybe at City Hall. And then we will be asking people for their ideas. And we will probably say, please take 2 months to think about it. Do you have ideas that stand out to you? People could say land protection in the coastal zone, restore salt marsh. We'll probably get some ideas that aren't viable. Gee, could you build us a new school? We get those all the time. In the end, our objective is to restore an equivalent amount of functions and values ecologically that were lost over those years of damage. And you don't get that building buildings, even though
Right.
So
Well, that was one of my questions for you too. Like, it's easy to think that you could, oh, there's $5.3 million. We can use it to do this because there are so many needs in the wastewater treatment plant and so forth. But this is restricted.
yes.
So, so it's restricted only to habitat restoration.
And proactive. So what I mean by that is even a wastewater treatment plant is actually doing good things for the environment, but that's permitted. It's required. It has its own permits. Sometimes someone may be doing a project where they have to do compensatory mitigation by a permit, by law. This money can't be used to fulfill state or federal requirements under any permitting authority. So it's proactive, which is kind of a nice thing. It's above and beyond the good things that are actually being required through other permits. This is above and beyond anybody's requirement.
Well, I mean, there's so many projects on the list around here. I have a question about the other Cape Ann communities, just not Gloucester, but could they see some kind of restoration project from this? And would the public engagement also include other folks from Cape Ann to see if there was, like you mentioned earlier, like if there was something right over the border that would help the fisheries in Gloucester Harbor? But I'm just wondering.
We will have criteria that will be part of the solicitation process that we also evaluate. And one of them will be distance from the impact area. So all things equal, a good project downtown Gloucester, a good project in downtown Manchester, everything else equal, in theory it goes to Gloucester because it's that criteria is we want it as close and as beneficial as reasonable. Now, one of the problems you have to always play out is the ability to actually do habitat restoration in the urban area of Gloucester is not cost effective in the downtown area, even though that's where the damage was. So we already realize that because we're not going to, I often joke with people, if you're doing work in Boston, we're not going to take the Prudential Tower down. I mean, all of Back Bay is restorable habitat. It's not getting restored. It's filled.
Right.
And if you wanted to buy it to even restore it, it costs too much. We want to spend this money in a way that gives us the greatest return for the greatest ecological and human benefit for Gloucester Harbor. So, is there a potential of it going outside of Gloucester? Yes. Diminishing returns under our modeling. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. I'm aware of a few really good projects in Gloucester that probably will be on the list, and we will certainly be probably pointed to a few others as well. So,
Do you have any, can you share those with us?
yeah, I can. I mean, there's a few out there that are generally public knowledge. One, for example, that many of us have had our eyes on for years is back in the 1950s or 60s when they dredged out the Annisquam River. They dumped all the dredged material on top of the salt marsh behind Wingasheek Beach. Literally dumped it. They built berms on top of the. Most people don't know this because no one goes.
Where is it? Where is it when you're on the Annisquam River?
When you go to Wingasheek Beach to go park,
Yeah.
you don't look this direction. You look towards the beach.
Right.
Park in the parking lot. Look in the other direction. Most of it's all invasive species because what they did is they built berms on the marsh, and they're all hidden now because all the invasive Phragmites took it over. It's one big, huge patch of invasive plants on an elevated marsh plain that's dredged disposal material. So that's a great opportunity to literally, you
take all the
take it
dredge
off
around away.
and put it in an appropriate location.
Right.
And whether you plant it or it grows on its own, you can grow salt marsh back there.
So
again.
you can restore the marsh in a situation like this.
Absolutely.
And this is a project that should be done anyway.
Yep. Yes. Right. Yep. So that's that's a large scale example that's publicly knowledgeable. There's knowledge of that.
Yeah.
The other is that's possible if there's land. We do land purchases. So if there's a parcel of land that has a nexus to the marine environment, on the edge, or it allows for sea level rise in the future, buys land that allows for migration of marshes or just intertidal habitat, that's something that could be viable in this process. We're not going to buy land in the middle of Dogtown per se. That'd be a different hat of mine, but there is still potential viable land that might be worthy of protecting. Though land is very expensive on Cape Ann, there might be some pieces that strategically and are cost effective. So that's an option.
Thanks for that overview, Eric. So what's next for when might we hear more about this ecological restoration project happening with the the 5.38 million, like soon or next year or
next year?
Okay.
And I'll caveat this, and it's good news. Because of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the American Recovery Act, we are implementing and putting out the door more habitat restoration money than in history right now. So we are actually swamped with good work, which is not a bad thing to have. It's unprecedented and it's very positive. So at the very moment, like right now, every one of my staff and all the staff I work with, we're reviewing grant proposals right now.
That's great.
One of the good things about that money that we have from the settlement, it's in an interest-bearing account. And interest rates have gone up. So it's collecting interest, and 5.38 million actually starts collecting sizable interest now that interest rates have gone up, enough to really add up. So keep that in mind. So it's not sitting in a non-interest-bearing account. It's going to be in an interest-bearing account.
Right. So there might be more.
Yes.
To spend.
There almost certainly will be because of that.
Right.
So as far as the timeline goes, our expectation is to do an RFP internally this winter, or start the process to hire a firm that will write the restoration plan, working in collaboration with the federal and state agencies. This winter, we hope to have that underway. The beginning steps of that won't be the public process. The beginning steps will be a couple of months of them getting oriented. They will be doing site visits, getting to know the geography with us. I'll be bringing them around, showing them sites. We'll be looking at documents and then preparing for public presentations to let the public know what we've found, what we're looking for, educate them. There'll probably be a series of a minimum of 3 public meetings to get input, a comment period on a draft, and then we'll have a comment period on a final document. And then that document, through the government process, will probably take multiple months to get final signature, but we usually don't have a problem getting that final signature. And then once we have the document, it's called a restoration plan and environmental assessment, signed, stamped, and approved, then the trustee council will then, that document will actually identify the projects we're targeting. So they'll be in it.
Great.
And then we will begin to implement them. And this is where the local level and others can come in. We don't necessarily do all the contracting. For example, the city of Gloucester may have a project that's near and dear to the Shellfish Department or the DPW or the Conservation Commission. There's a fair chance that funding could transfer so that the city could implement their project, or a nonprofit, Mass Audubon may have a project that they really want to do. Money could be transferred to them to implement, and then in some cases the state implements it, or in some cases us. There's a lot of flexibility, which is nice. There would almost certainly be an education and outreach component also throughout this, so that, we, in the end, it's not just about implementing habitat restoration, because in the end, if we don't have an educated, engaged citizenry, what good is it? This needs to grow. We need people, in the end, we need people who want to protect what gets built and to take care of it for the long term, because the government necessarily isn't there. This is our step, but in the end, it's the public that needs to care about these habitats that get restored. So there will be a component of that in some nature. Sometimes it's with the individual projects, and sometimes it's an overarching group that is actually doing the education on all the projects. And it might even only be one project.
Right. There might only be one project.
We don't know yet.
Right.
We're not there.
Right.
It could be 3. It could be, we've done, we're working on 2 cases that I'm working with that both around $4 to $5 million. One for Industrialplex that's in Winchester and Woburn. 3 big projects we're funding, with one overarching education, working with the Mystic River Watershed Association.
Oh, sure.
Nyanza, which is a big mercury spill in the Concord River. That one we did about 8 projects. From our perspective, too many. Ends up being, sometimes you can get too much administrative. If you're doing too many projects, you may be just spinning your wheels too much. So we don't want 20 projects, take my word for it. We want to find good, solid projects that deliver what we're looking for.
Well, we're looking forward to just hearing more about it as time goes by, and you'll give us an update.
Yep.
Well, great. Well, Eric, thanks so much for taking us through this. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. Thanks.
Good.
Common Crow Natural Market, Cape Ann's one-stop shop for natural and organic food, scratch-made grab-and-go treats and meals, natural and organic wellness and beauty items, and fair trade gifts and housewares. Kind service and knowledgeable staff will help you make the best choices for you. Our passion feeds you. Hi, we're back. I'm Maureen Aylward, Nature Winds podcast host, and I'm still here with Eric Hutchins, who's wearing his other hat of just being a Rockport resident and a lover of nature. So we're going to talk about a couple of things, because Eric is very knowledgeable about some of the things that are happening in terms of invasive pests, and some bad news about beeches. That means the beech tree, not our lovely beaches here in Cape Ann. So Eric, as a biologist and as someone who's interested and who lives here and loves Cape Ann, we're dealing with beech leaf disease, and I know that our audience is going to be interested to hear more about this. Could you explain what beech leaf disease is and what's happening to our beech trees?
Yeah. So, for the record, I'm not an expert tree person, but I'm out there all the time, almost every single day. And it was last year, out for a walk, which I do. I live in Dogtown, literally in the middle of the woods. I grew up in East Gloucester and Rockport. And every day out in the woods. And last spring, I think it was probably early May, maybe later May, I can't remember exactly, one of the spots my wife and I walk continuously, just something didn't seem right. And we know the areas so well, we sensed it. We actually felt it. And we looked around and said, something's wrong with the leaves here. And it had a little dry spell. And we think the first time we noticed it, we just kind of brushed it off, but we both talked about it. And then I think one day later, we walked out there and it caught our eye again. So now it already stuck in our mind. And at that point, I didn't know one thing about beech tree leaf disease. None. Zero. And I started looking at the leaves. And I'm like, something's really wrong with these leaves. They were crinkled. They had weird shading. And like, well, maybe drought. And then I started doing a little Googling.
Mm-hmm. Of course you did.
Yeah. And it was like, oops, very quickly. And it was the first identification of beech leaf disease in Rockport. And I started making a few phone calls. Talking to some people. It started, I believe, out in Ohio only about 12 years ago. Marched its way east to New Jersey area, and now it's been coming up the coast. It only arrived in Massachusetts, I believe, 3 years ago in Southeast. It's spreading like wildfire.
So what does it do to our beaches? What's happening?
So it's a kind of a fungal growth. They don't even, in all honesty, they don't even know yet exactly what is causing it and how it even transfers. We don't even know yet. It's that new, and it's just spreading everywhere. So what it does to the leaves, if you have a beech tree in your yard, if you go for a walk, just go look at those leaves. At this point, I'm not sure if there's a beech tree left in Cape Ann that's not infected. It's spread that quickly within 2 years. So last year, I started looking around. I found a small patch of maybe quarter acre. And then I did some other walks, and I found some other patches, quarter acre, where maybe half the leaves on a tree were infected. This year, I could not find a tree that was not infected. All my walks, all of them. The leaves are all crinkled up. They shrivel, they turn brown, and a lot of them even fell off. Many of the trees did a regrowth. They did a second growth of leaves, and it was kind of interesting. When trees are stressed like this, an average beech tree leaf is they get up to about 4 to 6 inches. That's a large one. I found beech tree leaves that I measured 12 inches. That's a reaction from trees when things are all messed up with them, which this was. They put out leaves and they make them extra large to try to regain some of the photosynthesis that they lost with all the leaves that fell off in the spring.
They're trying to protect themselves, right? Are they shutting down?
They're shutting down, and they're trying to protect them. They want to get energy down in the roots. The other thing to look for is when the trees were starting to die up above, baby shoots were coming out of the ground, because that's the way a lot of our beech trees in this area reproduce. They send roots down. They're all clones, and there's thousands of clones coming up all over Dogtown or all over the place. So that's another way they try to, because the fungus we don't believe is in the ground down in the roots. So they send up a new clone. The leaves come out, and then it gets infected.
So you think it's something that's passing in the air, like
it's got to be airborne to some degree. They've wondered, is it migratory birds? Is it insects? But how could have it reached so many so quickly? They don't even know.
So this is bad news for the beech tree. Like these are trees that these are like heart trees. These are majestic, beautiful, amazing trees that are like dreamy. This is so sad.
Yep.
What kind of a time frame are we looking at if they're infected? Are we going to lose them in the next 5 years?
Everything I've read is expect most of them to die in 3 to 6 years.
So these are the big trees, these are little trees?
Yes, that's what I've read. I mean, it's happening so quick. There's not even many scientific papers written on them yet. So it takes money to get so researchers have to apply for money. Then they have to develop their research plan and then implement it. It takes time. You got to hire grad students to go out there and study. It's happened so quickly. The research is coming mostly out of Ohio and New Jersey. I don't even know if Massachusetts even has any studies underway. They probably do, but it only arrived 2 years ago.
So there's just no time.
It's happening that quickly.
It's happening so fast, and there's nothing that can be done.
At this point, there's no, the one thing that people have said is if you've got a beech tree in your yard, fertilize it, give it more nitrogen, to just give it more strength in its roots, but it's not an antidote. So at this point, there's no
guarantee.
Yeah, there's no one to call up and say, save my beech tree.
Right. So there's this beech leaf disease that we're talking about, but isn't there another?
Beech beech bark disease.
Beech bark disease. Boy, this tree is really getting it all.
And beech bark disease has been around for decades.
Okay.
And you'll see it when you go out in the woods. You look at our beech trees, and they look like Sleepy Hollow, like with holes through them, and they've sustained themselves through it, but it's not helping them. So now they got the double wham. Well, there's actually triple. So you've got beech bark disease, you've got beech leaf disease, then you've got climate change on top of it.
Drought.
Drought.
The drought last year probably didn't.
We've had a number of droughts.
Yeah.
And then even the beeches got eaten a little bit by the gypsy moth invasion. They hit mostly the oaks, but they also did nibble on the beech trees a little bit. And our invasion 3 and 4 years ago was one of the worst episodes that Cape Ann has ever had with gypsy moths. It wiped out dead a large percentage of oak trees throughout Cape Ann.
Yeah.
Look at West Gloucester. So we're losing the
West
beeches.
Gloucester.
At the same time, we're losing the oaks. The big worry is, do invasive species come in with this opportunity?
So what does something like that look like? You know, what happens? You know, what kind of pests could come in?
Invasive grasses, multiflora rose, bittersweet. There's a whole variety of species that could infiltrate these areas. Time's going to tell. We're going to find out soon enough, because all those oak trees that drop into the ground that died 3 years ago, and in the next couple of years, if the beeches die, we're going to have a lot more sunlight in open areas with no trees.
Right.
It could be, in many cases, an okay succession. Oaks may come back in. Time's going to tell. Now, you have to keep in mind the other thing. It was only 15 years ago that woolly adelgids arrived. And actually, I was the first person to identify them in Rockport. Most of our hemlocks are already dead.
That's right.
So,
yeah, explain about what happened to the hemlocks.
Yeah, the woolly adelgid, which is it's a moth type thing that grows under the leaves, insect, basically sucked the life out of all of our hemlocks. And hemlocks are particularly important because they live on the edge of wetlands. And they shade wetlands and keep them at water temperatures cooler. So with climate change creating higher temperatures and then losing evergreens that kept our waterways cooler, now the sun's going to infiltrate our waterways and wetlands more. So there's, it's kind of, it's a secondary loop. So we got two things happening at the same time.
Well, what do you say to folks who say, well, we can plant more trees?
You can plant trees on a absolutely, but in particular on a landscape perspective in a yard. To be able to go out and plant trees over 3,000 acres of Dogtown gets insurmountable. And it's happening all the way from New Jersey. They're in Maine now, all the way out to Ohio. We're losing landscape, geographic scale of an important tree species.
Are you talking about the hemlock now, or are you talking about beeches and
both?
All of them.
The hemlocks are on
and the
their,
oaks.
Yeah, the hemlocks are certainly on their way out because of the woolly adelgid. The oaks will assumably revive themselves now that the winter moths and the gypsy moths are kind of at bay right now in our area. But it killed a lot of them. Hope is that a lot of the oaks can make their way back and we don't have an invasion again of them. But you can only deal with so many cycles. That's
Right.
the problem.
So what do you say to, there's the New England Forestry Foundation that's been in the news recently. They received a $30 million grant to do what's called smart forestry. And what they're looking at, harvesting forests and planting trees and forests, and to use this to, especially now, to combat climate change. What is I'm not sure if you're familiar with that group, but
Yep.
they do have a piece in Gloucester. They have a parcel in Gloucester that they're managing.
Yep.
So, is that something like that possible?
It absolutely is, and part of it is, even from a climate change perspective, one of the number one things we can do from a carbon perspective, even cost per acre, is just protect trees. Just protect trees and hold carbon in the roots and the structures of a tree. So part of it is just protect them any way we can through a variety of ways. Open space protection, planting more trees, protecting what's there, and active management, which they're doing.
What about people who are thinking about cutting down a tree or two? I mean, there's a lot of trees that get cut down by people who property owners and such, and it's hard to see when a big tree comes down.
Yeah, if you want to call it a recommendation, there is for people to increasingly just think twice about, does the tree need to come down or not? Many trees will come down. Many trees need to come down for
Disease or rot, or
a tree's going to fall on a power line. Certain level of management needs to take place. But we should be increasingly thinking about opportunities, even with a subdivision. Historically, so much a subdivision happens, and 10 house lots, tear everything down and they start again, versus work with nature. Selectively design development so that old age trees are part of your development. So think about it that way. I mean, in everyday activities, look for and implement opportunities for shade trees to be planted in the urban areas, protect them where there is going to be development. Parking lots, look for opportunities to plant trees, look for opportunities to protect natural trees that are there now through open space protection. We realize more trees will be cut down, but there's opportunities to offset it.
Well, there's a book called To Speak for the Trees, and I know that there's a plan in that book that talks about every person, if every person plants 6 trees in their lifetime, there's a chance to just keep it's good for climate change. It's good for carbon storage, and good for global warming, to reduce warming. And what do you say to that?
What I would say to that is that's a really good opportunity, but potentially a better opportunity that is actually at people's fingertips is for everybody that owns a grass lawn, everybody, to look at their lawn and choose some piece of it, whatever you're comfortable with, and naturalize it. Even the size of this table, if every person in this country converted this size of their lawn to a wildflower patch native to that area, it would be tremendous. It doesn't take a lot. It doesn't have to be wholesale. It doesn't have to be, gee, I can't have a 100-foot tree next to my house. Patches of naturalizing lawn is probably the easiest, simplest, most cost-effective way to do restoration at the individual level. And
it's so important. I just ripped up these 2 small patches of lawn in my front yard, and I planted a bunch of native plants, and I'm also going to plan on doing that in the backyard too. It's a growing movement. It's great to see. I know that there's a pollinator garden at Blackburn Circle. If you're when you're driving around Blackburn Circle, you can see this circle in the middle. Well, that's great. And just for the few minutes that we have left, Eric, wanted you to get your thoughts on biodiversity loss, the invisible biodiversity loss that we might not see, that about, or that you've picked up over time. This creeps along and creeps along and creeps along, and then we sort of somehow, like you said earlier, sense it and feel it. Something's been lost, but we can't quite put our fingers on it. What are the vulnerable species right now? Where could we look to see biodiversity loss?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back down to the micro scale first, because in some ways, I think it's more important. In the past 20 years, the megafauna have promoted, and they need to be, polar bears and whales and, a lot of the things that we see and cherish and should. But where really I worry the most and see the greatest opportunity and greatest loss is actually at that insect level, at just the basis of the food chain, not the top end, but the lower levels. As when people fret about invasive species and get all upset about an invasive plant that comes in. Think about your roof in a roadway. There's no habitat there. And that's what we as humans do. Our infrastructure wipes out habitat altogether. We've got to find ways to make up for that lower level. And this is where I go back to the yard. Mm-hmm. Doing things for nature at the individual level, in people's backyards. Because there's data sets now scarily showing up all around the world of, people that go out there and take a net and fling it through the bushes 3 times and count the number of bugs. And this is done a lot of places all around the world.
Right. Yeah.
Those data sets are showing 60, 75% reductions in those little bugs that we may not like because they bite us or they scare us. But
they're essential.
They are the basis of the entire food chain and the system that we love, to see our squirrels and to see our raccoons and our animals and our birds of prey and our bird populations. Their biodiversity depends on those small bugs. Mm-hmm.
Also called the insect apocalypse.
Yeah.
Right. That's what we're seeing right now. Someone, I forget where I saw this, but was a note like, when was the last time you had bugs on your windshield? Yeah. And for those of us who grew up here and have, remember all the bugs on the windshield, I haven't seen any like that in a long time.
And think about that. If you just casually see that change, how big of an impact it really is.
Yeah. I mean, it's so much bigger once we start seeing it and realizing it and all of that, those huge amounts of loss there in the insect world. So there's not much we can do about it, right? Or is there?
Well, there is, and that's kind of
insecticides.
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, that's
get rid of insecticides and stop Roundup.
Right. There's been a lot of efforts, and some are getting implemented, and it's obviously sinking into a lot of people. A lot of people are just saying organic garden only. First of all, an awful lot of those very same people that are saying organic garden only, like, why do I want to put chemicals on it, are starting to build little patches for the animals and the insects, and that's a movement. We won't solve these problems without an individual human movement. Government alone cannot solve this. It's absolutely, this is my opinion, it has to go to the individuals. The 300 million people in this country. We're not going to get all of them, but we need a lot more of them. It needs to be a movement where everybody recognizes they've got a part to play.
Yeah.
That's really it. Groups are creating the tools, and organizations like Mass Audubon and Yale School of Forestry, they're coming up with the tools. But in the end, individuals at their local level have got to implement those tools on the everyday basis to see the turnaround that we need.
Well, Eric, you're doing so much for our area in Cape Ann, and we're grateful to have you here and not someplace else. Thanks so much for being on the podcast with me today. And I definitely will have you back for an update on some of these things to talk about other items too. But thank you so much, Eric Hutchins. Thanks for tuning in, for listening and viewing Nature Wins podcast. I'm Maureen Aylward. It's been great to have you with us. See you next time. Thank you.